In this video, we will be replacing the positive and negative battery cables and connectors in this 2003 Toyota Camry. Taking a look inside the engine bay, we want to focus our attention on the driver's side portion, right near where the battery is. Taking a look at our battery terminal connectors, they have seen better days, and we are just going to replace these and start fresh. And starting with the negative terminal, using a 10mm wrench, I can loosen that up and remove that connection point. And it's always good practice to cover that temporarily. My positive terminal connector can be removed next. And again, I cover this just out of best practices. After that, I can remove my bracket holding the battery. And I can work that around and remove the battery. Taking a look at my positive battery terminal connection point, I can trace the lines and see that one of those lines runs underneath the air filter housing assembly. And much in the same, my negative battery terminal connection, if I trace those lines, I also have one traveling underneath the air filter housing assembly. So to gain access to these lines, I'm first going to remove my 2 bolts holding on my air filter cover. I'm then going to remove the mass airflow sensor connection, as well as my ducting, and just set that to the side for right now. In the bottom of my air filter housing, I have 3 bolt locations. This vehicle only has 2 of the bolts, although I suspect that typically you would see 3. And these are also 10mm bolts. And we can pull that unit out. Beginning with our positive side, we're going to trace that line. And we're going to follow that into the starter. Now I do have a couple of visual hindrances with the battery tray, as well as the bracket for my air filter housing base. Probably not absolutely necessary to remove those, but this will aid in the process. And we can now get a pretty clear visual on that positive side running from the battery terminal connection point down around and into the starter. And our starter then has a dust boot that we can remove. And this connection point uses a 13mm nut and a lock washer. I can then work that cable off of the retaining clips. And I'll go ahead and remove the air intake just to get a little better access to my retaining clip behind that ducting. And then I'll disassemble my terminal connection end. And this uses a 12mm socket. And we can work those 2 ends apart. Taking a look at my old cable, there are a few components that I'm going to utilize for my new cable. To remove these, I first need to cut my old cable so I can slide these components off. And we can then start prepping our new cable. We will be using 2-gauge stranded cable. And we're first going to slide that through our old component. And we're going to slip on that dust boot. And at this point, I'm going to give myself plenty of extra cabling And we can strip off the end of the cable, add a wrapper, and then our new end, and we can clamp that down. Make sure it's on there good and tight, and warm up that coating. And I can then reinstall that onto the vehicle. And slide that dust boot back in place. And we can slide those cable mounts back on. Now, because I don't want to get confused, I'm going to mock up the location of the battery so I can size my positive lead cable and complete this portion of this process before moving on to the negative side. And when I do this, I will give myself just a little bit of almost a service loop, if you will, just so I have a little bit more material to work with. And again, if this needs to be redone down the road, there will be a little bit extra material. At this point, I'm not fully sure what the best fit is going to be, so I'm going to try a couple different configurations to get me about where I want to go before reinstalling all of the air filter housing assembly and air intake and anything else that could potentially interfere with the running of these cables. I'm also going to switch out the end on my positive lead running to the relay and fuse box so I can have a better connection point on my new battery terminal connection component. So at this point I am pretty happy with the way that it looks. I'm going to remove the positive side and wrap that, take the battery out and the tray so I can start working on the negative side. Taking a look at the negative side, I can trace my leads, one of which goes underneath the battery base. The other one I can follow to the engine block. The one at the base of the battery looks as if it is in poor condition, so we will begin by working on this one. I'm going to use a little Amsoil metal protector to act as a penetrating oil to aid in the removal process. And this is a 10mm bolt. And using a wire brush and some Amsoil metal protector, I can clean that up. And I did end up using an abrasive wheel to clean off much of the rust, although not absolutely necessary. I do want to start with good base metal. I will be coating this in Amsoil heavy duty metal protector to prevent it from rusting in the future. But again, I just want a good solid connection for my ground. And I can begin with the process for creating my first negative battery cable. And I will be going up a size from the original, sticking with my 2 gauge. And as I had previously stated, I will be coating this with Amsoil heavy duty metal protector. This will help prevent rust and corrosion in the future. I can then follow my next negative battery cable, and I see that there are a couple areas where it is held down. I can very carefully work these up. And that cable then leads to a 12mm bolt mounted to the engine block. And we will again begin this process by creating our first end. And installing that in the vehicle. And with that installed in the engine, I can remove my little riser hold down cable clamps and remove the zip tie portion. And this will leave me a small hole that I can feed a new zip tie through. And that can be installed back on the vehicle. And we can do that in both locations. And at this point, I'm going to reinstall some of my components, starting with the air intake. This will allow me to position all of the cables where they will go permanently, followed by our bracket for our air filter housing assembly base. And next we can install the air filter housing base. And we can reassemble that air filter housing, making sure to reconnect our mass airflow sensor, as well as tighten up the clamp for the ducting. After that, we can put our battery base in, as well as the battery, repositioning the cables into the approximate location. And at this point, we can begin laying out the hookup for our negative side. And I'll again add just a little bit of slack in case we need to do further work on this down the road. My negative side looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this and cover it temporarily so that I can secure the battery and then hook everything back up. And we want to start by hooking up our positive side first, and then followed by the negative. And at this point, we can take it for a test drive and make sure everything sounds the way it should and the vehicle starts the way it should. And this repair is complete.